The first time the young one came out of the trees, I was sitting on a cedar log about 30 yards from the water, and I had not built a fire because fires draw attention, and I had learned years ago that attention was the one thing I could never afford to bring to that stretch of the Hoh. I was 68 years old. I had been retired from the National Park Service for 2 years, and the reason I had driven back out to the Hoh River Road that October evening in 2019, walked the 9 miles in on a trail I had walked more times than I could count, and settled onto that same cedar log I had been coming to since 1984, was because I had told myself it was just a walk, a goodbye walk, the last one. I was not expecting what came out of those trees. I was not expecting to see what I had spent 40 years protecting. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Tom Harlan. I spent 38 years as a backcountry ranger at Olympic National Park, assigned for most of that time to the Hoh River corridor on the western slope of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. I hired on in the spring of 1979, fresh out of a 2-year stint with the Army Corps of Engineers and a ranger trainee program at Mount Rainier. I was 29 years old, unmarried, and I had come to the Olympics specifically because the backcountry assignment there was considered one of the hardest postings in the Pacific West region of the National Park Service. The terrain was brutal, the weather was worse, and the area of park I would be responsible for patrolling was so remote that in those years before satellite communications became standard, there were stretches of time when nobody outside the park had any reliable way of knowing whether you were alive or dead. I am not telling you that to make myself sound heroic. I am telling you because understanding what that job was, what it actually required of a person, physically and psychologically, is the only way you will understand the choices I made over the next 4 decades. The choices that led to that cedar log and that October night and the small shape that stepped out of the timber while the river ran gray in the last light. I grew up in Sequim, Washington, on the dry side of the Olympic Peninsula, in the rain shadow of the mountains where the annual rainfall drops to about 17 inches, and people grow lavender instead of ferns. My father, Dale Harlan, worked for the Clallam County Road Department for 30 years. My mother, Ruth, kept a vegetable garden and managed the books for a small hardware store in town. We were a practical family. We did not talk about things that could not be explained. We fixed what was broken and ate what we grew, and my father voted in every election and never missed a day of work in his life. That is where I come from. And I say that so you understand that what I am going to tell you is not the product of an overactive imagination or a lonely old man trying to make his life sound more interesting than it was. The Hoh River drainage in Olympic National Park is one of the most intact temperate rainforest systems remaining in the lower 48 states. The Hoh River itself originates in glacial melt on the flanks of Mount Olympus, which at 7,980 feet is the highest peak in the range, and flows westward for about 56 miles before emptying into the Pacific Ocean south of the town of Forks. The river valley is a flat-bottomed glacial trough flanked on both sides by steep forested ridges, and the forest on the valley floor is old growth. Sitka spruce, western hemlock, big leaf maple, and western red cedar. Old growth by definition means trees that have never been logged, and in this case some of the Sitka spruce specimens along the lower trail measure over 300 inches in circumference at chest height. The understory is dominated by oxalis wood sorrel and sword fern, and a moss community so dense and continuous that every horizontal surface in the forest is upholstered in green. The moss grows on the trees, on the fallen logs, on the exposed roots, on the rocks, in the creek beds. In the rain, which falls between 140 and 170 inches per year at the valley floor, the whole forest drips and trickles and breathes moisture in a way that is not like any other environment I have ever experienced. It does not feel like standing in a forest. It feels like standing inside something alive. The Hoh River Trail runs from the Hoh Visitor Center at the end of Upper Hoh Road for approximately 17.5 miles to glacier meadows at the foot of the Blue Glacier on Mount Olympus. The trail is remarkably flat for the first 13 miles, following the river through the old-growth forest, passing 5 Mile Island, a broad gravel bar meadow system where Roosevelt elk gather to graze, continuing past the Happy Four backcountry campsite at roughly 6 miles, crossing a log bridge over a side drainage at about 8 miles, and eventually reaching the Olympus Ranger Station, a historic backcountry cabin constructed in the 1930s by the Old Forest Service, at 9.1 miles. That ranger cabin was my base of operations for 22 of my 38 years. I spent more nights in that one-room log structure than I spent in the apartment I rented in Forks. I knew every board in its walls and every drip of its roof in a hard rain. My first patrol assignment as a permanent backcountry ranger was in the spring of 1981. I had spent my first 2 seasons at the park in a kind of apprenticeship under a senior ranger named Phil Denning, who had been working the Hoh Corridor since 1968, and who taught me everything about the valley that could be taught by a human being, where the elk herds moved in the seasonal migration from low-elevation winter range to high summer range, which creek crossings were dangerous in May when the snowmelt was running, how to read the weather coming off the Pacific by the way the clouds stacked against the ridgeline above the Hoh Lake drainage, how to move through the forest quietly enough that you did not spook the elk and the deer and the bears that the trail passed through. Phil retired in the summer of 1980 and moved back to his wife's family property in eastern Oregon, and when he left, he handed me a folded topographic map with certain areas marked in pencil and told me that those were the places I needed to pay attention to. I asked him what I was paying attention for. He said I would know when I needed to know.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Phil's map markings were concentrated in the upper drainage, roughly from mile 11 of the Hoh River Trail to a point about 2 miles above the Olympus Ranger Station. There were 3 specific locations he had marked with small X's and a notation in his careful handwriting that said simply, "Sign." I did not know what sign meant in the context of those particular coordinates, but I kept the map and I kept those locations in the back of my mind through my first solo season in 1981. My first patrol of that season took me to Glacier Meadows and back over 4 days. I saw elk at 5 Mile Island, 2 black bears working the berry patches on the north slope above the trail at about mile 7, a family of river otters in a calm pool just downstream from the log bridge at mile 8, and a marten that chased a squirrel across the trail directly in front of my boots, somewhere around mile 10, and disappeared into the brush without acknowledging my existence. The park was full of wildlife in those years, full in the manner of truly roadless wilderness, where the animals have not learned to associate human presence with danger, where the bears are fat in late summer and the elk calves are already on their feet in June and the salmon come up the river in October and the whole ecosystem pulses around you like something with a heartbeat. I did not find whatever Phil's X marks were intended to point me toward on that first patrol. What I found, on my second solo patrol in mid-August of that same summer, changed the rest of my life. I want to be precise about the date because dates matter in a story like this. It was August 14th, 1981. I was on a northbound patrol, moving up the Hoh River Trail toward the ranger station after a 2-day layover at the 5 Mile Island camp, where I had been monitoring a herd of about 65 Roosevelt elk that the park's wildlife management team was tracking that season. I was moving at a steady pace, probably 3 miles an hour on flat ground with a 40-pound patrol pack, and I had just passed the mile 11 marker, which in those days was a small orange metal rectangle nailed to a spruce trunk when I smelled something. I want to stop and explain what I mean when I say I smelled what I smelled, because the word smell does not quite cover it. The Hoh rainforest has its own constant olfactory baseline that becomes so familiar after a few seasons that you stop registering it consciously. Wet earth, organic decay, the sweetness of oxalis and wood fern, the sharp, clean smell of the river, the mushroom smell of the duff layer, and over all of it, the green smell of the moss. That is the background. Against that background, what I hit in the trail around mile 11 was unlike the baseline. Animal in a way that the forest's usual animal smells, elk, deer, bear musk, marten spray, were not. It was denser than any of those. It had a quality that I can only describe as layered, the way a large mammal that has been wet and has dried and been wet again many times carries a smell that is not just one thing but an accumulation of days and seasons on the same body. It was the smell of age and wildness, and something I did not have a word for. It stopped me in the trail. I stood still for what was probably 2 minutes, but felt longer. I was not afraid at that point. I was paying attention the way Phil had taught me to pay attention, registering the information coming through my senses without projecting a story onto it. The smell was strongest from a direction uphill and to the left of the trail, toward the base of the north ridge. I turned that way and looked into the timber. Old-growth spruce at that point in the valley have trunks so large that the spaces between them at eye level form a series of deep chambers, each one shadowed and still. I looked into those chambers and I did not see anything. But I heard something. A sound that I am certain was a footfall on duff. Not the quick dry sound of a deer or elk hoof on the trail surface, but a heavy, deliberate, almost cushioned impact. Once, then again, then silence. Then the sound of a very large body settling its weight against a tree. A sound you can feel through the soles of your boots if the ground is soft enough. A low vibration. The kind a cedar trunk makes when a big animal leans against it and the root system transmits the pressure down. I felt that vibration. I heard it through the forest floor. I stood there looking into the trees for another 2 minutes, and I did not see movement of any kind. The smell began to dissipate, moving downwind along the river. I took out my patrol log and wrote down the time, the mile marker, the direction, the smell, and the sounds I had heard. I did not write down what I thought they came from. I did not let myself think it yet. I was a ranger. I worked in evidence. I talked about it with nobody. The second time was October of that same year, which put it past my patrol season. I had stayed on an extra 2 weeks to complete a trail maintenance inventory for the Resource Management Division, which was standard practice for a full-time permanent ranger. The seasonal staff had gone home in September, and there was always a backlog of late-season documentation work that fell to the permanent staff. I was at the ranger station, which had been fully winterized for the season, working by headlamp on my inventory notes, when I heard something on the cabin's south wall. Not on the roof, not on the door. On the wall itself, a slow, deliberate contact, as if weight pressed against the logs from outside. It lasted about 30 seconds, and then stopped. I sat very still with my headlamp off for a long time. Long enough to let my eyes adjust to what little ambient light the cloudy sky allowed through the single south-facing window. When I could see well enough, I got up and checked the perimeter of the cabin. I found no tracks in the soft ground around the structure. What I found, on the south wall where the contact had come from, were 2 patches of resinous material pressed into a split in the log chinking. Dried vegetation. I identified it the next morning in daylight as a combination of sword fern fronds and what appeared to be the inner bark of western red cedar, pressed flat and then pushed into the gap in the chinking with some force. Not from inside, from outside, at a height of about 8 feet from the ground. I kept that material in a sealed plastic bag in my patrol kit for the rest of my career. I still have it. By the spring of 1982, I had read everything the park library had on the Roosevelt elk herd, on the known wildlife of the Olympic Peninsula, on historical accounts of the Hoh drainage, and on the oral traditions of the Quileute people who had lived on the Western Peninsula for thousands of years before the national park was established in 1938. The Quileute called the peninsula home because the Hoh River was salmon water, and salmon was the spine of their culture, and they had been in these forests and on this river for so long that their oral history contains some of the only records of what the valley looked like before non-Indian settlement. I found through the Clallam County Historical Society's archives in Port Angeles, a collection largely undigitized as of the early 80s and still only partially available on any public database. As of my retirement, a series of field notes compiled by a Quileute cultural liaison named Henry Payne, who had worked with the Park Service in the 1940s and 50s to document traditional place names and spiritual sites in the park. Those notes had never been formally published. They were typed on onion skin paper, bound with a shoelace, and filed in a cardboard box labeled Peninsula Ethnography Miscellaneous in the back of a storage room at the Historical Society. Henry Payne's notes included a section on what he called the Old Ones of the High Valley. He described a tradition among the Quileute hunters who worked the upper Hoh drainage before the park restricted access, a tradition of leaving food at certain points along the river smoked salmon, mostly, or dried venison at locations they considered transitional ground between the human-accessible forest and the high country beyond. Payne wrote that the hunters understood these locations as places where the forest changed character, where the old growth became something older, where the animals moved differently. He quoted an elder named Martin Eastman who said in Payne's translation, "You do not go past those places without making an offering. The watchers of the High Valley have kept the elk here since before memory. You give them respect or you take nothing." Payne noted that the locations Martin Eastman described corresponded, roughly, to areas along the upper Hoh River Trail between miles 11 and 13, which was exactly where Phil Denning had put his penciled X marks on the topographic map. I am not a superstitious person. I was not then, and I am not now. But I am a practical person, and the practical fact was that by the spring of 1982 I had one smell event, one sound event, one physical artifact of unknown origin, a set of marked coordinates from an experienced ranger who had worked the valley for 13 years, and a century-old indigenous oral tradition that independently pointed to an unusual presence in the same stretch of river. A practical person does not ignore a convergence like that. In April of 1982, on my first solo patrol of the season, I stopped at the base of a Sitka spruce at mile 11.4 of the Hoh River Trail. I had wrapped a piece of smoked salmon in cedar bark following the Quileute method described in Payne's notes. I set it at the base of the tree, and I walked on to the ranger station without looking back. The next morning, the salmon was gone. Now, I want to be clear about a point that anyone with backcountry experience will immediately think of: bears. Black bears are active throughout the Hoh drainage from April through October, and a piece of smoked salmon at the base of a spruce tree is precisely the kind of food a bear would investigate. I am not claiming the salmon's disappearance was proof of anything. What I am saying is that I left salmon at that same tree on every patrol for the next 2 months, and I began paying very close attention to the circumstances under which it disappeared and the circumstances under which it remained. By mid-June of 1982, I had established patterns that did not fit a bear. Bears are opportunistic and unpredictable. Their scavenging behavior is not consistent in timing or pattern. A piece of food left at a forest location will be taken by a bear at whatever point a bear happens to pass by, which can be hours after placement or days. In every case over those 2 months, the salmon I left at mile 11.4 was gone by the following morning's patrol. Regardless of what time I left it, when I switched my offering to late afternoon and came back the following morning, gone. When I switched to early morning and came back 8 hours later in the same day, gone. The timeline was too consistent for opportunistic scavenging, and on 2 occasions I found the cedar bark wrapping placed neatly upright against the tree trunk, not shredded and scattered as a bear scatters packaging. A bear does not unwrap and stack. I said nothing to anyone. I filed my patrol logs as normal. I documented wildlife sightings, trail conditions, campsite usage, and permit compliance. I did not write down the salmon or the cedar bark. I made a decision in the spring of 1982 that I have had 43 years to second guess and have never once regretted. Whatever was accepting my offerings in the upper Hoh, its safety depended entirely on remaining unknown to the institutions I worked for. The National Park Service is a land management agency. Land management agencies respond to unknown large mammals in wilderness areas in ways that end badly for the large mammal. I had been a ranger long enough to know how that went. I was not going to be the person who started that process. By the summer of 1983, I had shifted from smoked salmon to a combination of foods that I varied with intention over the course of the season to get a clearer picture of what I was dealing with. I left venison jerky, dried berries, raw salmon, coho specifically because it was the salmon species native to the Hoh, dried camas bulbs, which were a traditional food in the Pacific Northwest, and on one occasion a small bunch of ripe salal berries that I had picked on the valley margin. The responses helped me understand preferences. The salmon was always taken first. The camas bulbs were taken reliably. The salal berries were taken most of the time. The venison jerky was taken inconsistently. This was useful information, not because it told me definitively what species I was dealing with, but because it told me I was dealing with a being that had food preferences reflecting both protein sources and plant foods, one with a digestive system that could handle the range of what I was leaving, and one that, over time, became reliably willing to interact with offerings I had placed specifically for it. The first visual contact happened on June 9, 1984. I want to be exact about this because it is the center of everything that followed. I had finished a permit check at the 5 Mile Island camp that afternoon, verified 3 backcountry permits, documented an elk herd of about 42 animals in the river meadow, and started northward toward the ranger station, where I was staying for a 5-day stretch. It was late afternoon, the light already going amber and flat under the forest canopy, and I was walking at a reduced pace because I was not in any hurry, and the forest was doing what it does at that time of day, settling into a stillness deeper than the full light of midday. The birds that had been calling through the afternoon went mostly silent. The river, which I could hear but not see at that point on the trail, seemed louder in the relative quiet. I was at approximately mile 11.3 when I noticed that the quality of the light in the forest ahead of me had changed. Not dramatically, not the kind of change you could point to and say, that tree is casting a different shadow, more the way your eye registers something and sends a flag to your attention before your conscious mind has processed what the flag is about. I slowed down. I had learned by then to trust those flags. My eyes moved from the trail to the forest interior on the left side of the trail, up the slope toward the ridge, and I saw it. I saw it for approximately 6 seconds before it moved behind the trunk of a large spruce tree. 6 seconds is not very long, but when you have spent your professional life developing the observational skills that backcountry ranging requires, 6 seconds of clear sightline at a stationary subject is enough to form an impression. What I saw was large, very large, standing upright in the way that primates stand upright, with the weight distributed differently than a bear on its hind legs. Bears on their hind legs are always looking for a reason to come back down. There is a muscular tension in their posture that reflects the awkwardness of bipedalism for a quadruped. What I saw was not awkward. It was still. The way something stands still when it has decided to let itself be seen rather than when it is surprised. It was covered in hair, and I use that word with care rather than the word coat, because coat implies the short, dense pelt of a domestic or furred animal, and what I saw was longer, darker, more textured than that. The kind of coat that accumulates years and seasons the way old growth accumulates moss. It was standing partially behind a spruce trunk at an angle that obscured most of its body, but the shoulder and upper arm visible on the left side of the tree were wider than any human shoulder I had ever stood next to, and the hand that gripped the tree bark, because it was gripping the tree bark, fingers wrapped around the edge of the trunk, was large enough to wrap around bark that was 12 inches across. It looked at me. I will not try to describe what passed between us in those 6 seconds except to say that it was not a predator-prey look. It was not an animal scanning for threat or assessing me as potential food. It was a look of assessment, yes, but the kind of assessment that involves recognition. It knew me, or something about me that made me known. I do not know how else to put it, and I am aware of how that sounds. But I spent 38 years making judgment calls about wildlife behavior in wilderness settings, and I trust my read on animal behavior more than I trust almost anything else. And what I am describing was not the behavior of a wild animal encountering a human. It was a different category of awareness entirely. After 6 seconds, it moved behind the spruce and did not reappear. I stood on the trail for a long time, and then I walked on to the ranger station, and I sat in the dark for a while before I lit the lantern. I did not sleep much. In my patrol log, I recorded the time, the location, and the note. Unusual movement in timber, north side of trail, mile 11.3. Unable to confirm species. No sign of distress or aggression. Filed for record. That is all I wrote. I had been a ranger for 6 years by then. I was good at writing things down and equally good at knowing which things not to write down. After 1984, the relationship, and I am going to call it that because it became one over decades, in the way that any long and intentional exchange of attention and care between two beings becomes a relationship developed along a gradient so gradual that I sometimes think the only reason I recognized it for what it was is because I was paying attention the whole time. Not the kind of attention that looks for proof, the kind that just stays present with what is actually there. The offerings continued every patrol. The location shifted slightly over the years, always in response to some signal I was receiving that I had to learn to read the way you learn to read trail sign, not from a textbook but from repeated exposure and accumulated pattern recognition. By the late 1980s, the location had moved from mile 11.4 to a point just above a particular log crossing over a small side drainage at mile 11.8, where a grove of very old western red cedar stood on a bench above the river. Cedar in the Hoh drainage can reach 1,500 years in age. The oldest of those trees had been standing when the Spanish first put ships into the Pacific. I started leaving the offerings at the base of the largest of those cedar trunks. A tree with a base circumference that I measured once at 23 feet, and which had a deep overhang of bark and root buttress that created a partial shelter from rain on the north side. That shelter had been used. I knew it had been used because the duff on the ground under it was compacted in a way that matched neither the trail nor the surrounding undisturbed forest floor, and the bark on the north side of the trunk at a height of about 9 feet bore marks that were consistent with repeated contact over many years, not the random gouging of a bear marking territory, but smooth wear, the kind that comes from the same surface touching the same spot over a long time. 1989 was the year I was assigned a junior partner for the summer season, a seasonal backcountry ranger named Kevin Brand, 24 years old, from Tacoma. Kevin was smart, physically capable, and enthusiastic in the manner of someone getting their first assignment somewhere that actually resembles the reason they went into the work. He loved the Hoh. He came out of his first solo patrol of the upper drainage, talking about the quality of the light and the size of the trees and the sound the river made at night, and I recognized in him the thing that the valley does to people who are genuinely attentive to it. It opens a door. The problem was that Kevin was also meticulous and curious, and one afternoon in late June, he stopped at mile 11.8 while we were doing a joint permit check patrol and pointed at the cedar tree and said the ground under there looked like it had been used recently. He was right. I had left an offering 2 days earlier and the ground showed it. I told him it was probably a bear that had sheltered there during the previous week's rain. He looked at the bark wear marks at 9 feet and said, "Bears do not leave smooth contact marks at 9 feet. They leave claw gouges." I said this bear was probably using it as a rub tree and the rain had smoothed out the gouges. He gave me the look that intelligent 24-year-olds give you when they know you are holding information back but do not yet have enough to press to say so directly. I changed the subject. Kevin finished his seasonal assignment in September and went back to Tacoma, and eventually took a permanent position in the North Cascades. I have kept track of him over the years. He had a good career. He never came back to the Hoh. I have been grateful for that more times than I can say. The summer of 1993 was the closest I came to having the whole thing unravel. A group of 4 hikers from Olympia, all members of a club that did annual backcountry trips, were camped at the Happy 4 site at mile 5.8 when they reported to me during a routine permit check that they had heard something in the night that had frightened them badly enough that 2 of them were considering cutting the trip short. They described the sound as coming from upriver, north of their camp, and lasting for roughly 45 minutes, starting at around 2 in the morning. They said it was not any animal they recognized, not an elk, not a bear, not a cougar, whose calls they knew because 2 of them had heard cougars in other parts of the Olympics. One of the women in the group, a retired school teacher named Barbara, told me it had felt territorial. She used that exact word, like a large animal was marking a boundary with sound. I asked them to describe the sound. What they described was a series of low, percussive vocalizations, rhythmic but not regular, with intervals of silence between them, and under those vocalizations a continuous low-frequency resonance that they felt more than heard. Barbara said it made the walls of her tent vibrate. Another hiker, a man named Dave, said it was the single most unsettling sound he had heard in 30 years of backcountry travel. And he said it the way people say things that are completely true, without drama, with the flatness of a fact. I told them I believed what they had heard was a large Roosevelt elk bull in the early stages of the fall rut. I said bulls in the Hoh drainage produce some of the most unusual vocalizations in the park due to the particular acoustic qualities of the river valley and the old-growth timber, and that the resonance they had felt was a known phenomenon caused by infrasound components in elk bugling that could carry several miles through old-growth forest. I said all of this with the complete authority of a man who had been a ranger in this specific park for 14 years. I told them they were in no danger. I sent them on with their trip. I want to be honest about what I did there. I lied. Not entirely. Roosevelt elk bulls in the fall rut do produce remarkable vocalizations, and the acoustic properties of old-growth forest do amplify and distort animal sounds in unusual ways. But what those 4 hikers heard was not an elk, and I knew it. And I told them it was because telling them the truth was not something I was willing to do. I had been making the same calculation for 12 years by then. The safety of what was living in that upper drainage outweighed any obligation I had to the hiker's right to an accurate explanation. They went home unharmed. Nobody lost anything, except maybe my integrity. Depending on how you look at it, I have thought about that a lot over the years. My conclusion is that integrity is not a simple thing. It is not just about telling the truth. It is about holding your commitments when the holding is hard. I had made a commitment, not in words, and not to anyone who could hold me to it, but the kind of commitment that forms between a human being and another kind of being over years of consistent, honest behavior. I had never tried to document or capture or report what lived in the upper Hoh. I had never brought anyone there to see it. I had never let my institutional role supersede my responsibility to what had come to trust me. That was the commitment, and I held it. 1996. I need to tell you about 1996 because that year a change happened in the relationship, and the change was so gradual and so unannounced that I almost missed its significance until I had time to think back on it from a distance. By the mid-90s, I had been a senior ranger in the Hoh corridor for 15 years. I knew the valley the way I knew my own body, which is to say well enough to notice when a difference was present before I could articulate what the difference was. In the spring of 1996, I noticed that the offerings I was leaving at the cedar tree were being responded to differently than they had been in prior years. Not differently in terms of what was taken. The pattern of food preferences had been stable for a long time. Differently in terms of what was left in exchange. This had happened before, occasionally and unpredictably. A small arrangement of objects at the cedar tree when I came back on a return patrol. Smooth river stones placed in a configuration that was not random. Elk antler shed, placed against the root buttress, as if leaned there with purpose. A bundle of dried plants that I identified over time as mostly sword, fern, and a small amount of what appeared to be dried serviceberry, tied with a strip of cedar bark. I had documented these finds privately, in a journal I kept separate from my official patrol logs, and I had noted that they seemed to follow extended periods of wet or cold weather when my offerings might have represented a more significant contribution to a diet that other sources were not fully supporting. I interpreted them carefully, without projecting as a form of reciprocity. The exchanges that happen between beings that have established a working understanding. In 1996, the exchanges became more frequent, and the objects left at the tree became more varied. River stones continued, but I also found, on 4 separate occasions that summer, objects that were clearly not native to the immediate valley environment. A piece of blue glass, smoothed by water into a small oval, the kind of sea glass that washing up on the coast west of Forks. A section of Douglas fir bark, about 8 inches long, with a pattern of gouges in it that looked deliberate, not random claw marks, but a symmetrical arrangement of parallel lines that did not match any tool mark I had seen in the forest. A feather that I identified as belonging to a bald eagle, bound with a strip of inner cedar bark to a small twig. I did not know what any of these objects meant in the sense of translating them, but I knew what they communicated, which was a recognition I had to approach carefully and without rushing to a conclusion. The being in the upper, Hoh, was aware of me as an individual, and it was responding to me as one, not just taking food from a location, responding. The understanding that came with that recognition sat with me for a long time. I was 46 years old in 1996. I had been alone in the practical sense of solitude for most of my career. I had been in a relationship with a woman named Carol Estes in the late 80s, a teacher from Port Angeles who came out to the Hoh once for a day hike and understood afterward that the person she was seeing across the dinner table was only partially there. We parted without bitterness. I had a good life, a contained life, and in the middle of that contained life, in a cedar grove on the floor of a rainforest valley, something was leaving me sea glass and eagle feathers and taking my salmon. I did not tell Carol. I had not told anyone. I was not going to start. The second decade of the relationship brought a new challenge, and it came from inside the institution. In the late summer of 2001, a younger ranger named Danny Cho, who had been assigned to assist with a trail census in the upper Hoh drainage, came back from his solo survey of the mile 10 to mile 13 stretch with photographs he had taken on a disposable camera he was using to document trail conditions. Among the photographs were 2 images he had taken of the ground near a muddy section of trail just below the log bridge at mile 11.8. He showed them to me in the Hoh Visitor Center at the end of the road, spreading them out on the desk with the casual interest of someone who has found an anomaly and is not yet sure what it means. The photographs showed 2 clear impressions in the mud. Bipedal, human in general shape but substantially larger than any human foot I had measured in over 20 years of backcountry work, where you occasionally have to estimate the foot size of hikers from their boot prints for search and rescue documentation. The impressions were roughly 17 inches in length and showed a clear arch pattern and 5 distinct toe impressions. The largest toe set slightly apart from the others in a way that was consistent with a climbing or gripping function. They were deep impressions, which indicated significant mass, and they were in a section of trail that Danny's census data showed had had no backcountry permit holder traffic in the 48 hours preceding his visit. I looked at those photographs for a long time. Danny was watching me as junior rangers watch senior rangers when they have found an anomaly they cannot explain and are hoping the experienced person will provide the explanation that makes it ordinary. I told him the impressions were almost certainly from a barefoot backpacker, which was unusual, but not unheard of in the park, and that the size exaggeration was a product of how soft mud expands around a print when the foot is withdrawn. I told him the asymmetric toe pattern was consistent with a foot with significant bunion deformity on the outside of the great toe. I told him I had seen similar impressions twice in my career, and both times the follow-up investigation had identified a barefoot or minimally shod hiker. I was deliberate and specific and authoritative, and Danny was young enough and deferential enough that he accepted the explanation. He put the photographs back in their envelope and filed them in the documentation box for the census. And as far as I know, they were never examined by anyone else. I retrieved those photographs from the documentation box 3 months later, when the census files were being archived at the end of the season, and I replaced them with 2 photographs I had taken of an unrelated section of trail. The originals are in a box in the closet of my house in Forks, with the cedar bark material from 1981 and the objects from the cedar tree, and about 40 years of private journal entries that I have never shown anyone. In 2008, a man named Richard Allard came through the Hoh with a research permit and a backpack full of audio recording equipment. He told me at the trailhead, when he signed in for a 5-day backcountry permit, that he was an independent researcher working on a project documenting the acoustic environment of temperate rainforest ecosystems, and that he was particularly interested in infrasound signatures in old-growth forest corridors. He had institutional affiliation with an acoustic ecology research program at a university I will not name because the program has since been discontinued and the individuals involved have moved on. He was polite, knowledgeable, and careful to frame his work in the most scientifically conservative language possible. He did not say the word Bigfoot. He did not have to. I had been a ranger for nearly 30 years, and I had met enough researchers with peripheral interests in unknown primate biology to recognize the framing when I heard it. I gave him his permit. Then I went back to my patrol schedule and made sure that when Richard Allard was in the upper Hoh drainage between miles 10 and 13, I was also in that stretch, running what I logged as a routine maintenance inspection. I walked the drainage at the same time he did, on the same days. And my presence, my footprints on the trail, my voice speaking to him when we crossed paths, my very ordinary human activity in that stretch of forest produced a silence in the behavior I had spent years observing. Nothing approached the cedar tree while Richard Allard's recording equipment was deployed within 2 miles of it. I know this because I checked the offering site daily during his stay, and the offerings I left were undisturbed until the morning of the day he departed, when they disappeared as reliably as they always had. Richard Allard went back to his university with recordings of the Hoh River, the wind in old-growth timber, the calls of Pacific wrens and Steller's jays and barred owls. He wrote a paper. It did not contain anything of significance about the upper Hoh. He never came back. By the time I retired in the spring of 2017, I had been making the same patrol up the Hoh River Trail for 36 years. Not every patrol in every season went all the way to the cedar tree, but I had visited that spot often enough that I had stopped counting at some point in the early 2000s. I had left offerings there through drought years and flood years, through years when the elk population was down and the river ran low in August and the forest seemed to contract around itself, and through years when the snowpack was deep and the spring runoff was spectacular, and the 5-mile island meadow was so thick with elk that you could hear them from a mile away. I had left offerings through the northern spotted owl controversy in the late 80s and early 90s, when the logging battles in the surrounding forest were at their most intense, and the boundary of the park felt like a contested line rather than a managed edge. I had left offerings through 3 administrations' worth of park management priorities and 2 major organizational restructurings of the Pacific West region. I had left offerings in rain and in the infrequent patches of autumn sun that reached the valley floor between October and March. I had left offerings, and I had kept the secret, and I had told the lies that were required to keep the secret, and I had done it alone. My retirement ceremony was held in the Hoh Visitor Center on a rainy Friday in April of 2017. About 30 people came. My supervisor, a woman named Janet Tran, who had managed the Hoh district for 12 years and was about as close to a professional peer as I had had in the later years of my career, gave a speech that was generous and accurate about the work I had done, the trails I had maintained, the search it helped coordinate, the citations I had issued, the educational programs I had run for school groups. She said I was the institutional memory of the Hoh corridor, which was both a compliment and a precise description of a kind of knowledge that cannot be transferred or documented, that lives in the body and the pattern of attention of the person who has spent time enough in a place to know it below the level of conscious thought. I thanked her. I drank the coffee someone had made in the visitor center kitchen. I shook hands with people I had worked with for years and said the things you say at those events. And I drove back to Forks and sat in my house and tried to figure out what I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. The first year of retirement was harder than I had expected it to be. It was not that I lacked things to do. I kept busy, volunteered at the Forks Food Bank, helped a neighbor build a woodshed, took a trip to Portland to see my sister, but the Hoh was 12 miles away and I was not going to it. The cedar tree was still there. The relationship I had maintained for 36 years had no formal closure. I had just stopped showing up. In the second year, I started letting myself think about going back. Not for a patrol, for a walk. People who are not rangers walk the Hoh River Trail all the time, and there is nothing unusual about a retired ranger walking his old corridor as a private citizen. In the late fall of 2018, I went as far as the 5 Mile Island camp and sat by the river for an afternoon. And the whole valley felt the way it always felt, and I went home knowing I was going to make it to the cedar tree eventually. I just was not ready yet. October of 2019. I was 69 years old. I drove out the Hoh River Road in the early afternoon, parked at the visitor center parking lot, nodded to a young ranger named Mike, who was doing parking lot checks and who recognized me but was too young to have worked with me directly, laced up the boots I had worn on this trail for the better part of a decade, shouldered a light pack with 2 liters of water and a rain jacket and a headlamp and a small parcel wrapped in cedar bark, and walked north into the forest. The walk-in was 2 hours and 40 minutes, at a pace I had not kept up in 2 years of retirement, and my hips told me about the last half mile. But the forest was doing what it always does in October, which is settling into the quiet that comes after the tourist season ends and before the winter rains make the trail inaccessible. The elk had moved up to the high summer range and were beginning to drift back down, and at 5 Mile Island I stopped and watched a small group of about 22 cows and calves feeding in the river meadow in the low afternoon light, as I had watched elk in that meadow for nearly 4 decades. The Hoh ran clear and low as it runs in October before the fall rains increase its volume. A pair of mergansers worked a shallow pool in the gravel bar. A great blue heron stood on a snag across the river in that absolute stillness that herons achieve, the stillness that makes them look like they have always been there and always will be. I walked on, past the Happy Four camp, which was empty, past the log bridge, which had been reinforced since I last walked it and now had a proper handrail, which was an improvement the trail crew had been planning for years, past the section of trail where in 1981 I had stopped and caught a smell that stopped me in my tracks. Everything was familiar in the way that only places you have known for decades are familiar, where the familiarity is below the level of recognition, in the body's memory rather than the conscious mind's. My feet knew the trail better than my eyes did. I reached the cedar grove at mile 11.8 in the last thin light of the afternoon, about 40 minutes before full dark. The great cedar tree was exactly as I had left it 2.5 years earlier, which of course it was. It had been there for over 1,000 years. It was not going anywhere. I unwrapped the parcel of cedar bark and set the contents at the base of the root buttress on the north side. Smoked coho salmon, a handful of dried service berries, and a small folded piece of paper on which I had written a number. 38. The number of years. I do not know why I did that. I do it. No, it felt right. I walked back down the trail about 300 yards to a fallen cedar log I had been using as a seat since the mid-90s, positioned just off the trail on a slight rise that gave me a partial sight line back toward the grove without being directly at the offering site. I sat down. I did not build a fire. I turned off my headlamp. I waited. The darkness in old-growth temperate rainforest is a particular kind of darkness that takes some getting used to. There is no direct sky visible from the valley floor and most of the upper Hoh drainage. The canopy is complete enough that on an overcast October night, once your eyes have adjusted and you realize they are not going to adjust any further because there is simply no ambient light to adjust to, you are left with the information of the other senses, the river, close enough to hear at maybe 200 yards, moving at an October volume that was moderate and steady, the drip of the over canopy onto the fern layer below it, because the fog that sits in the valley in autumn condenses on the needles and drips even when it is not technically raining. The occasional sound of a forest at rest, a branch settling, a root creaking under the weight of a tree that has been growing for centuries, the almost inaudible movement of air through the old growth that is less wind than breathing. I sat for a long time. My watch said 8:43 when I stopped looking at it. The forest around me was quiet in a mode I had come to understand over decades as meaningful. Not the absence of sound, but the active stillness of a place in active attention. I had sat in this forest enough times to know the difference between the neutral silence of late evening and the particular quality of quiet that precedes a change. This was the second kind. I smelled it before I heard anything. The same smell from August of 1981, unchanged in all the ways that matter and more complex in the ways that 38 years of accumulated seasons make anything more complex. Dense and layered and wild, in the specific way that has nothing to do with the word wild, as most people use it. This was not the wild of adventure, tourism, or nature documentaries. This was the wild of a presence old enough and confident enough in its own existence that it does not need to modify itself for anything. The smell was upwind of me, and it arrived the way it always arrived. Before I was ready, however ready I thought I was. Then I heard the footfall. Single step. To my left, uphill, from the direction of the cedar grove. Heavy and deliberate and placed on duff the same way I had been hearing footfalls in this drainage since 1981. Then a second. Then silence. The kind of silence that is not the absence of movement but the presence of what had stopped. I did not move. I did not reach for my headlamp. I had learned a long time ago that the approach to the cedar grove was on the understanding that I would stay at the log, that I would not advance, that whatever was being offered was offered from a specific radius, and that the boundary of that radius had become a thing I respected the same way you respect any boundary between yourself and what you want to keep trusting you. The footstep came again, closer, not from uphill now, from the direction of the trail itself, to my left, at a distance I estimated at maybe 30 yards, and then a sound I had never heard before in all the times I had sat at this log. A smaller sound, lighter, quicker. The sound of a body considerably smaller than what I was listening for moving in the understory. A rustle, the kind a small body makes when it is moving through sword fern without the experience to move quietly. A small sound, and then, immediately after it, a soft, low sound from the larger source that was not vocalization in any conventional sense but was communication in the most direct sense I know. A settling sound, the kind you make when you are telling something small and uncertain that what is in front of it is not a threat. I sat very still and I breathed as quietly as I have ever breathed in my life. What came out of the tree line was small. Small in the context of what I had seen at mile 11.3 in June of 1984, which means small in a relative sense that most people would not apply to an upright figure that was probably 5 feet tall and covered in the same dark hair as the adult. It came to the edge of the tree line and stopped. I could not see its face in the dark. I could see the shape of it, a darker shape against the darkness of the forest interior. Upright. Uncertain in its posture in the way that young things are uncertain in new situations. It was looking in my direction, and then from the darkness behind it, to its left and slightly behind, the shape I had been seeing at the edge of my vision in this forest for 38 years. Large enough that even in the dark and at 30 yards I could feel the scale of it as you feel the scale of the largest trees in the grove, not just with your eyes but with something older than vision, standing still, watching me, I've spent a lot of time trying to find the right way to describe what happened next, and I think the only honest description is this. Nothing happened, and everything happened. Nothing moved. Nobody spoke. Nothing changed in any external documentable way. What changed was inside me, in the space between understanding and feeling, where the things you have known for a long time finally arrive in the place where you can hold them. I had been feeding this animal for 38 years. I had been protecting it for 38 years. I had been keeping it secret for 38 years. And it had known all of that, not in the way a trained animal knows its handler, not with the dependence that conditioning produces, but as any being comes to know another that has been consistently honest with it over a long period of time. It knew what I was, not what species I was, or what job I had held, or what institution I had served, what I was, and it had decided, on this one October night in 2019, that the small being beside it was old enough or ready enough or whatever the right word is to come to the edge of the trees and look at the person who had been present in this place their entire life. The young one looked at me for a while. Then it turned and moved back into the tree line. The adult stood for another moment, long enough that I registered the deliberateness of it, the choice to remain visible, before it also moved into the darkness of the cedar grove and was gone. I sat on the log until I was sure I could stand without my legs failing me. And then I stood up and turned on my headlamp and walked back down the Hoh River Trail in the dark, 9 miles to the parking lot at the visitor center, and sat in my truck for a while before I drove home to Forks. I did not cry on the drive home. I am not telling you that to claim some kind of stoic credit. I am telling you because the emotion I felt that night was not primarily the kind that produces tears. It was larger and quieter than that. The kind of feeling that does not need an outlet because it is not trying to go anywhere. It is simply there, filling the exact shape of the space inside you that has been waiting for it for a long time. There is a thing that happens to people who spend decades in wilderness work, or in any work that requires prolonged attention to the natural world in its unmodified state. You begin to lose the human habit of scaling the world to your own importance. The elk at 5 Mile Island have been gathering in that meadow for longer than any living human being has been alive. The cedar trees in the grove at mile 11.8 were already 1,000 years old when the first European ships put into the Pacific. The Hoh River has been flowing to the sea since the glaciers that carved this valley retreated 10,000 years ago. You are not the center of this story. You are a passing presence in an unimaginably old world. And if you are lucky and attentive and honest, you get to participate in it briefly before you are gone. What I had participated in for 38 years of my working life was a relationship with a being that the world I came from had no framework for. The world I came from was not incapable of understanding such a relationship, but because the world I came from had largely stopped paying attention to the parts of existence that require patience and stillness and a willingness to let understanding arrive in its own time rather than forcing it. The Quileute people whose oral history I had read in Henry Payne's Onion Skin Notes had understood that you do not go past certain places without making an offering. They had understood that the watchers of the high valley had kept the elk there since before memory. They had understood this because they had been paying attention for long enough that the knowledge had settled into a permanent shape, a truth you pass down because it matters, and because the truth of it matters to everything that follows. I had kept the elk there, not as the old ones of the high valley kept the elk there, not across centuries and in ways I do not fully understand, but in my particular fashion, which was that of a man whose job it was to manage and protect a piece of wilderness, and who had chosen to let one part of that management remain outside the institutional record. I had made a judgment, repeated and renewed every year for 38 years, that there were 2 things in the Hoh River drainage that required protection, and that only one of them could be named in the documentation. The other one I protected with silence. I have been asked, in the weeks since that October night, whether I regret any of it. The lies, the suppressed photographs, the misidentified sounds, The researchers I gently redirected. The junior rangers I kept out of certain parts of the trail at certain times. Whether I feel that my obligation to the truth as an officer of a federal agency should have superseded my judgment about what the truth would cost in this particular case. I have thought about this question more carefully than I have thought about almost anything in my life, and my answer is no. I do not believe I was always right. What I believe is that the rightness or wrongness of what I did cannot be separated from the outcome, and the outcome was that something is still alive in the upper Hoh River drainage that would not be alive if I had made different choices. Something that has a young one now, something that has been in that valley. By the evidence of Henry Payne's notes and Phil Denning's marked map, for at least as long as human memory on this peninsula extends. I am 72 years old. I live in Forks, Washington, on a street 4 blocks from the main road. My neighbors are a retired logger named Charlie Warwick and his wife Denise, and a young family whose children play in the front yard on weekends in a way that is very loud and very reassuring about the continuity of ordinary things. I have a garden that produces more tomatoes than I can eat in a summer. I volunteer 2 days a week at the food bank. I take a walk every morning on a route that does not go anywhere near the Hoh River Road, because the walk I need to take in that direction I have already taken, and the right thing to do now is leave that corridor to the management of the rangers who are there and to whatever is living in the cedar grove at mile 11.8. I have not gone back since October of 2019. I do not plan to go back. The night with the young one was a conclusion. And conclusions that are true feel like conclusions. You know them by the absence of the need for anything more. I went out there for 38 years because I was needed there. I went out one more time because I needed to go. And then I came home, and I have stayed home, and the Hoh is doing whatever the Hoh does without me, which is what it was doing before I was born, and what it will do long after I am gone. The young one looked at me from the edge of the trees in the dark. The adult stood behind it and watched. Those are the facts. What they mean is a question I have been working out slowly, the way you work out the large things, not in a single sitting but over time, in the small hours of mornings, when you lie awake and let the big questions take their shape. What they mean, as best I can say it, is this: trust is not a thing you earn and then have. It is a thing you earn and then tend. Every day, every patrol, every offering, every lie told in service of a larger honesty, every choice to keep the secret rather than advance my own interest or my institution's interest or the interest of human curiosity about what is living in the wilderness. 38 years of tending. And on one October night, the tending was acknowledged in the only way that mattered, which was not with words or documents or anything that could be recorded and filed and archived, but with the simple fact of being shown something that is not shown to many people. A young one at the edge of the trees, uncertain and watchful, and there, and an adult behind it that had decided, after 38 years, that I was safe. I keep the cedar bark from 1981 in a sealed bag in my closet. I keep the smooth blue sea glass from 1996. I keep the eagle feather bound in a strip of cedar bark. I keep the photographs from 2001 that Danny Cho took with his disposable camera and that I removed from the archive. And I keep the private journals, 40 years of them, that document every offering and every response and every piece of evidence and every choice I made about what to do with that evidence. I have not decided yet what to do with any of it. Probably nothing, while there is still a living presence in the cedar grove that could be harmed by what is in those boxes. But I am telling this story now because I have thought about it for 5 years since that October night, and I think the telling of it without the evidence, without the documentation, without my name on any formal record, is not the same thing as the documentation. The telling is what you do when you are old enough to know that the things you have carried alone are too important to be buried with you, and wise enough to carry them in a way that keeps what they are protecting safe. You tell the story in the form that reaches the people who need to hear it. And those people know what to do with it because they have their own stretch of trail they have been walking, their own cedar grove they have been coming back to, their own version of the offerings and the responses and the long, slow building of a trust that the world outside the forest would not know what to call. If you have had that, or if you have stood in a place where the forest went quiet in the specific way I have been describing, or if you have caught a smell on a trail that had no name and stayed very still and waited and felt a presence looking back at you from the dark space between the trees, then you know what I am talking about. And if you have never had that, then I hope this story has given you the stillness you would need to have it someday. The Hoh is still there. The elk still come down to 5 Mile Island in the fall. The river still runs blue-gray from the glacier all summer and dark green from the rain in November. The cedar tree at mile 11.8 is still there, 1,500 years and counting, its root buttress making that partial shelter on the north side, where the duff stays compacted and the bark shows wear at 9 feet from the ground. The offerings I left on that last night in October are long gone now, taken in whatever way they have always been taken, added to whatever sustains what lives in the old timber above the upper valley. The young one is in those trees, growing as young things grow, in the particular way that things grow when they are growing up in the oldest intact forest in the continental United States, with the river and the elk and the rain and the 1,000-year cedar and the knowledge, passed down in whatever way such things are passed down, that there was once a human being who walked this trail for 38 years and left salmon at the base of the big tree and kept the secret and told the necessary lies and turned the necessary people away and chose, again and again, the silence that protected what was here over the documentation that would have served his career or his curiosity or his need to be believed. I am glad I made those choices. I am glad every single day that I made those choices. The young one looked at me from the edge of the trees, and I understood, in that moment of looking, that the 40 years were not a sacrifice. They were a privilege. The kind you only recognize when it shows its face to you in the last light of an October evening, small and uncertain and completely alive, at the edge of the oldest forest in the lower 48, trusting you with the most important thing it had. What I have told you so far is the shape of the thing, the beginning and the end, with the necessary middle compressed, as all long stories get compressed when you are trying to get to the point that matters. But the middle of this story is not a compression. The middle of this story is the whole thing. 40 years of individual patrol days and individual decisions and individual moments of contact that accumulated, as all real relationships accumulate, into something that neither party could have anticipated at the start, and that neither party could have undone without a fundamental betrayal of what the accumulation had built. I want to tell you the middle more carefully, because the middle is where you understand why it ended the way it ended. The 1980s in the Hoh River corridor were years of enormous external pressure on the forest I was working in. The logging controversy over the northern spotted owl was not yet at its full pitch when I started in '79. That would come to a head in the late '80s and early '90s, but the tension between the timber industry based in Forks and the conservation mandate of the park had been simmering since the park's establishment in 1938. Forks in those years was still genuinely a timber town, the self-proclaimed logging capital of the world, and the people I lived among were people whose livelihoods and identities were bound up in the forest in ways that the environmental movement, which was gaining power in the region during the Reagan years, did not always acknowledge or understand. I was a federal ranger. My neighbors worked for the mills and the logging contractors. I was not their enemy, and most of them knew it, but I represented an agency that they sometimes experienced as an adversary, and I was careful about how I navigated that. I say this because it is relevant to the choices I made about the Upper Hoh. The world around the park was arguing fiercely about what the forest was worth and who it belonged to and what uses justified what costs. Inside that argument, in a cedar grove at mile 11.8 of a trail that most of the people in Forks had never walked, there was a living presence that had been in that forest for longer than the argument, longer than the park, longer than the town, longer than European settlement on the Olympic Peninsula. The argument was happening at the level of board feet and timber jobs and owl habitat and park boundaries. What I was protecting was operating at a completely different level, one that the argument had no language for and no framework to accommodate. I understood that. I kept the two things separate in my mind and in my professional conduct, and I am grateful I had the discipline to do so, because there were moments in those years when the crossover would have been easy and catastrophic. 1987. A wildlife biologist named Sandra Prentice, contracted by the park for a Roosevelt elk population study, spent 3 weeks in the upper Hoh drainage conducting direct observation and scat analysis and radio telemetry work on a collar they had placed on a cow elk the previous winter. Sandra was meticulous, skilled, and very good company during the 2 days we overlapped at the Olympus Ranger Station. She was from Oregon State, the wildlife biology program, and she had that researcher's combination of genuine passion for the subject and complete methodological discipline that made her both pleasant to work with and potentially dangerous to the project. I was quietly running in the same landscape she was studying. She found fresh elk sign in an area above the cedar grove at mile 11.8, a place where the north slope shelf above the trail flattened briefly before rising again to the ridge, and she spent a day up there that I was not with her for, checking her telemetry and documenting what she found. She came back to the station that evening with a question that was worded carefully in a mode that careful scientists use for questions when they are not sure whether what they found is real or artifact. She had found, on the shelf above mile 11, a series of features in the forest floor that she did not have an ecological explanation for. Circular depressions in the duff layer, each roughly 4 feet across, in a loose arc along the shelf. Not created by fallen trees, she had checked for root structures and found none. Not consistent with the wallowing behavior of elk bulls in the rut, which creates a different shape and a different odor signature. Not a natural drainage feature because the soil was uniformly deep there with no bedrock outcropping. She wanted to know if I had any knowledge of what might create that kind of feature in the old-growth duff layer. I told her I had seen similar features in 2 other locations in the park, one in the Quinault drainage and one in the Salduke area, and that our working hypothesis was that they were the result of long-term use by pileated woodpeckers excavating for carpenter ant colonies in the root layer below the duff. I told her the features tended to develop over many years as multiple birds worked the same location and the disturbance gradually expanded. I told her it was interesting but not unusual in old-growth stands, and that the size of the features correlated with the size of the trees in the stand, which accounted for why she was seeing them at scale in this particular section of the valley. I was calm and specific and entirely convincing, and Sandra Prentice wrote a brief notation in her field book, and we moved on to talking about the elk data she had collected, and I did not volunteer anything further about the shelf above mile 11. I want to be direct about a point that might otherwise be lost in the accumulation of these incidents. I liked these people. Sandra Prentice was a good scientist and a good person. Danny Cho, the young ranger who photographed the tracks in 2001, was exactly the kind of thoughtful, curious, meticulous ranger that the park needed and was lucky to have. Richard Allard, the acoustic researcher in 2008, was doing honest work in a framework that was as scientifically rigorous as he could make it, given that he was investigating a subject that the mainstream academic world was not prepared to take seriously. I did not deceive these people because I had contempt for them. I deceived them because the thing I was protecting was not mine to share with them, and my judgment about who could be trusted with it was not based on the individuals but on the institutional apparatus behind them. Once Sandra Prentice's field notes became part of a formal wildlife study contracted by the park, they were subject to review. Once Danny Cho's photographs were in the permit documentation archive, they were accessible. Once Richard Allard had recordings, they were data he could analyze and publish. Any of those pathways could lead somewhere that the cedar grove at mile 11.8 could not survive. So I lied, carefully, to people I respected, in service of something they did not know existed and might not have agreed with me about protecting even if they had. That is the full moral complexity of what I did, and I am not asking you to resolve it into a cleaner shape than it actually had. The relationship with the Upper Hoh developed through the 1990s in ways that I found harder to categorize but easier to feel. The exchanges at the cedar tree became more varied. What had started as the simple disappearance of food offerings and the occasional found object evolved, by the mid-90s, into what I can only describe as a form of correspondence, though it was nothing as explicit or intentional as the word implies. The objects I found were not messages in any code I could decipher. They were presence, evidence of attention, a way of saying, I know you are here, you know I am here. The knowing is mutual. The most significant of these exchanges happened in the spring of 1998. I want to tell you this one carefully because it is the one that brought me to an understanding I had been slowly approaching for 17 years without quite arriving at it. I had been in to the ranger station for a 5-day late spring patrol, checking on trail conditions after the winter and conducting my first backcountry permit check of the season. The drainage had taken significant water over the winter, more than usual, and there was blowdown across the trail in 4 locations between miles 9 and 12 that I documented and reported to the trail crew for the remediation work they would do in June. At mile 11.8, the cedar grove was fine. Those trees are rooted deeply enough in the mineral layer below the duff that they are essentially immune to the wind events that bring down younger trees, but the approach to the grove from the trail had been significantly altered by a wind throw event that had dropped a large hemlock across the trail and into the cedar stand's south margin. The hemlock had come down across the small side drainage that the trail bridged just below the grove, blocking the log bridge entirely and piling debris on both sides. I was going to have to work around it to reach the cedar tree, which meant going off-trail through the understory for about 50 yards, which I had done many times in my career and was not especially complicated but took longer. I went through the understory, around the root ball of the fallen hemlock, and came out into the cedar grove from the south side, rather than the north where the trail normally brought me in. The approach from the south gave me a different angle on the big cedar. On the approach from the north, the root buttress on the north side is what you see first, the offering location, the compacted duff, the barkware at 9 feet. From the south, you see the tree from the other side, the side that faces the ridge rather than the river, the side that I had never spent much time on because there was no path there and no reason to go there as part of my routine. What was on the south side of the big cedar, carved into the bark at a height of about 6 feet from the ground, was a pattern of lines. I stood and looked at it for a long time. Lines are not unusual on old cedar bark. The wood is soft and the bark is deeply furrowed, and the combination produces patterns that can look intentional from a distance and resolve into purely natural formation up close. I had seen that kind of thing many times. This was not that. These lines were incised into the bark cleanly, without fraying or compression at the edges, which meant they had been made with something sharp and applied with control. They were arranged in a pattern that I would describe as follows. A central vertical line, perhaps 8 inches long, flanked on both sides by a series of shorter horizontal lines of varying lengths, the arrangement suggesting something between a notation and a map. At the bottom of the central line there was a single circle, about 2 inches across, drawn precisely enough that it was clearly intended to be circular rather than any approximation. I had the cedar bark seal in my patrol kit, and I pressed it against the bark to take an impression on the outside of the bag, an improvised documentation method. Not proper field archaeology, but the best I had available without calling attention to what I had found. I photographed the pattern with the small film camera I carried for trail condition documentation. I measured the lines with a flexible ruler I kept in my first aid kit. The pattern covered an area of about 11 inches by 14 inches. The central vertical line was incised to a depth of approximately 1/4 inch. The horizontal lines were shallower, about 1/8 of an inch. The circle at the base was the deepest mark in the pattern, nearly 3/8 of an inch. I do not know what the pattern meant. I have spent over 25 years looking at the impression I made that day and the photographs I took and have never arrived at a translation I am confident in. What I know is that the pattern was not there the last time I had been in the grove before the winter, which I know because I had taken a set of condition photographs of the cedar tree in late October of 1997 that showed the south face of the trunk clearly, and the bark on that face was unmarked at that time. The pattern had been made during the winter, when the trail was essentially closed to visitors and the drainage was under several feet of snow, when nobody was in the upper Hoh except the permanent wildlife that lived there year-round. It had been made by something that spent the winter in the upper Hoh. Whatever had spent that particular winter close enough to the big cedar to come to it and mark it. And whatever the marking meant, it was on the side of the tree that faced away from the trail and the river, the side that faced the ridge and the high country, as if it was addressed not to me but to whatever came down from the direction of the ridge. I added the photographs and the impression to my private archive. I told nobody. I kept coming back. By the year 2000, I had been a ranger for 21 years and a senior ranger in the Hoh corridor for 15. I had outlasted 3 district superintendents, 2 complete reorganizations of the park's management structure, and the spotted owl wars that had transformed the political and economic landscape of the entire Olympic Peninsula. The logging industry in Forks was a shadow of what it had been in the 70s, and the town itself was in the difficult middle stage of economic transition, not yet tourist economy and no longer timber economy, the place between things that small towns sometimes inhabit for decades. I had watched Forks change around me as you watch any place you live in long enough. Not with analysis, but with the accumulation of small daily observations that add up to a picture you can only see when you step back far enough. I was also, by 2000, in a different relationship with the work than I had been at the start. Not a worse relationship, not a diminished one, but a more honest one. I had no illusions by then about what the National Park Service was or what it was not. It was an institution, with all the things institutions are good at and all the things they are not. It protected land. It maintained trails. It educated the public about natural systems. It conducted wildlife management programs that were often excellent and sometimes wrong. It processed permits and collected fees and responded to emergencies and employed rangers who were, in the main, people who had chosen this work because they genuinely cared about the places they were responsible for. I had cared. I still cared. But my caring had a layer to it by 2000 that it had not had in 79, a layer that the institution I worked for could not access and would not have known what to do with if it could. My caring included the cedar grove at mile 11.8 and everything that used it. I had developed, in the years between the first visual contact in '84 and the turn of the millennium, a rough understanding of the seasonal pattern of presence in the upper Hoh. Presence was highest in late spring and fall, when the elk were making their elevation transitions and the herd concentrations at 5 Mile Island were at their peak. Presence was lowest in midsummer, when the trail carried the most backcountry traffic, when the drainage was warmest and driest, when the high country terrain above the ridge was accessible without snowshoe travel. This made practical sense. If you were managing your own exposure to human traffic, you would make the same choices. Late spring and fall offered the richest food resources at valley level and the least human competition for that resource. Midsummer offered the most human pressure and the least reward for staying in the lower valley. In the winters, I had no direct way to assess presence because I was not in the drainage during the long cold and snow events that made backcountry patrol impractical. What I could assess was the state of the cedar grove on my first spring entry each year. And what that assessment told me was that the grove was occupied during the winter. The compaction of the duff under the root buttress shelter was more pronounced every spring than it had been in the fall, and the bark wear at 9 feet continued to accumulate in ways that were consistent with regular contact over months. The grove was a winter shelter, or part of one. The ridge above it was, in my best reconstruction from the available evidence, part of a territory that extended upward into the high country, into terrain I had never patrolled and did not patrol, terrain that was officially wilderness and practically inaccessible in winter, and that the park's management resources did not extend to in any meaningful operational sense. Whatever lived in the Upper Hoh was not confined to the Upper Hoh. It was present there seasonally, reliably, and it had been present there in this pattern for longer than I had been keeping the record. Phil Denning had marked those X's on his map sometime in the late 60s or early 70s, which extended the minimum documented history of occupation to at least a decade before my own first encounter. Henry Payne's notes from the 1940s and 50s documented the Quileute hunters' knowledge of the same locations, which extended the oral history of occupation back further still, into a time before the park existed and before the logging era had transformed the surrounding forest. What was in the cedar grove at mile 11.8 was not a recent arrival or a transient resident. It was part of this landscape's permanent ecology. It had been here as the elk had been here and the salmon had been here and the old cedar trees had been here, on a timescale that made my 38-year career look like an afternoon. I understood this more fully in 2005 than I had in 1981, and the understanding changed the texture of the work I was doing in the upper drainage. It was less about an individual encounter and more about a long-term stewardship. I was not managing a discovery. I was managing the conditions that allowed what was ancient and alive in that place to continue being so in the place it had always been. The management I was doing was not the management the park paid me to do, but it was management in the deepest sense. I understood the word, the deliberate, continuous, careful application of attention to what you care about keeping. My supervisor from 2000 to 2012 was a man named Greg Hendricks, who had come to the Olympic from a career position in Yellowstone and who brought with him the management philosophy of a park that had large charismatic megafauna and active wolf and bison programs and the attendant challenges of high public interest in wildlife. Greg was a good supervisor in most respects. He was organized, fair, responsive to the needs of the staff, and genuinely committed to the park's conservation mission. He was also exactly the kind of supervisor who would have been unable to leave the matter alone if he had known about it. Not out of malice, but out of institutional responsibility. A responsible manager cannot know about an unidentified large primate using a specific location in his park and do nothing about it. The responsible manager reports it, initiates a protocol, brings in wildlife specialists, considers the management implications. That is what responsible management looks like. It is also what the end of 40 years of cautious stewardship looks like, from where I was standing. I managed Greg as I had managed every supervisor after Phil Denning retired, by being so thoroughly reliable and well-documented and institutionally credible in every other aspect of my work that my judgment in the field was simply not questioned. I had no violations, no complaints from hikers, no search and rescue operations that resulted in criticism of my decisions, no wildlife incidents in my corridor that reflected poor management practice. I kept the best patrol logs in the district and probably in the park. I knew the Hoh drainage with a completeness that no other person in the organization could match, and that expertise was the currency I spent on the privacy of the cedar grove. When I said something was a bear or an elk or a barefoot hiker or a natural feature, it was believed, because 30 years of impeccable professional conduct had established that Tom Harlan's word was evidence. I do not feel good about this exactly, but I feel that it was right. 2012 was the year that the trail crew doing blowdown remediation between miles 10 and 13 found a set of impressions in the exposed soil of a fresh blowdown scar at mile 11.6, about 200 yards south of the cedar grove. The crew leader, a woman named Alicia Romero who had been doing trail work in the park for 8 years, was not a wildlife specialist and was not trying to document anything when she found them. She was doing the documentation required for any blowdown remediation project, which included photographic records of the site before and after clearing, and one of her before photographs captured the impressions clearly in the foreground of the image. She filed her documentation. I was CC'd on trail remediation reports for my corridor. When I read the report and saw the photograph, I understood immediately that the impressions were going to be visible to anyone who looked at the documentation with any attention. I also understood that the blowdown scar was going to be visited by the trail crew over several days of work, which meant that if the impressions drew attention and generated questions, those questions would be asked of me. Alicia asked me about the photograph the following week, in passing, at the visitor center at the end of the road. She was matter-of-fact about it. She said the impressions looked unusual and wanted to make sure she had documented them correctly. I looked at the photograph with her and told her the impressions were consistent with a large black bear using freshly exposed soil as a mineral lick common at blowdown sites where disturbance exposes mineral-rich subsoil, and that the apparent size was likely exaggerated by the photography angle. She accepted this. She was a trail professional, not a wildlife specialist. She had no reason to push back. The photograph is still in the blowdown remediation archive at the park. I did not remove it, as I had removed Danny Cho's photographs in 2001, because by 2012 the park's documentation systems had migrated from physical files to digital archives that I did not have access to modify. The photograph is there. I do not know whether anyone has ever looked at it more carefully than Alicia did with me that day. I am not going to be the person who calls attention to it, but I am telling you it is there, as one more piece of a record that exists in fragments across multiple archives, and one private closet in a house, on a street in Forks, Washington, and that no single person except me has ever assembled into the whole picture. The last patrol I made as an active ranger to the Upper Hoh was in late October of 2016, 6 months before my retirement. I was 66 years old. I had been doing this walk for 35 years. The seasons had shaped me in ways that were not visible from the outside but were complete on the inside. I moved through that forest differently than I had moved through it in '79. Not just because my body was older, but because the forest and I had reached an accommodation that had nothing to do with any trail management protocol. I knew where to step and where not to step, where the trail surface was soft enough in October to show impressions, and where it was duff-covered enough to receive weight without record. I knew where the elk would be at that time of year, and where they would not. I knew the voice of the Hoh River at each mile of the trail, the way the gradient and the channel shape changed the sound of the water so that you could locate yourself on the trail by the river's voice alone. I left the usual offering at the cedar tree. Smoked coho, dried service berries. I had started adding dried camas bulbs again. By this point I had found, through trial and repetition over the years, that the camas was reliably appreciated in late fall, when the plant's nutritional density might compensate for declining access to other food sources. I set the offering in the usual place, at the base of the root buttress on the north side of the big tree, and I stood there for a moment in the way I always stood there, not praying and something between prayer and silence, present in a way that I cannot fully name, but that felt like the most honest thing I did in any patrol day. I walked back to my usual log on the rise overlooking the approach to the grove, and I sat, and the forest around me was doing its October thing, settling, quieting, the light going from amber to gray as the overcast moved in from the coast, and I sat until dark, and then walked back to the ranger station in the headlamp beam. That night I made my last entry in the official patrol log as a working ranger in the Hoh corridor. Trail conditions, wildlife sightings, campsite condition at Happy 4, elk count at 5 Mile Island. Standard information for a standard patrol. I closed the logbook and put it on the station's desk and sat for a while in the kerosene lamplight, which I still used at the old station, even though it had been wired for electric light in the '90s because the kerosene lamp was what the station was built for and kerosene light was what it looked like from the inside. And I thought about the 35 years that had gone into the accumulated documentation that lived in those official logs and what was absent from it and what I alone carried. I thought about Phil Denning and his penciled X marks on the topographic map and the question I had asked him about what I was paying attention for and his answer, which was that I would know when I needed to know. He had been right. I had known. I had been knowing for 35 years by then, adding to the knowledge with every patrol and every exchange and every choice about what to record and what to protect. And the accumulated knowing was not the kind of knowing that could be written in a patrol log because it was not institutional knowledge. It was the knowledge of a long relationship. The knowledge you carry inside a commitment that has gone on long enough to become who you are. There were things I should have done differently. I should have found a way to document the private record more completely and securely, because the boxes in my closet are vulnerable to the ordinary losses that aging makes ordinary, and the photographs and the journal pages and the cedar bark seal are objects in the physical world that can be damaged or lost or found by the wrong person. I should have thought more carefully about what happens to the private record when I am gone. And I have been thinking about that in the 5 years since the October night with the young one. I have not arrived at a resolution. I know what I am not going to do. I am not going to hand it to an institution. I am not going to make it findable by a researcher. I am not going to publish it or present it as evidence for anything. The record is the record of a relationship. It belongs with the relationship. And the relationship belongs to the cedar grove and the upper Hoh drainage and whatever lives there. And when I am gone, the record will either remain safely private or it will surface as things surface when they are ready to be seen. I will not control that from the other side. What I can control is this telling, the story in the form of a story, which reaches the people who are ready for it in a way that documentation never does. Documentation is for institutions. Stories are for people. And what I have carried for 40 years is ultimately a story about a person and a place and the long work of being trusted, which is a story that belongs to people, told in the manner that stories of trust have always been told, by the person who kept the trust, after enough time has passed to know that the keeping was the right thing, and before enough time passes that the keeping becomes only silence. I am Tom Harlan. I was a backcountry ranger at Olympic National Park for 38 years. I spent most of those years walking a trail through the oldest intact temperate rainforest in the continental United States, and for 38 of those years, I left offerings at the base of a 1,000-year-old cedar tree at mile 11.8 of the Hoh River Trail, and I protected what those offerings built from every institutional force that might have ended it. I did this alone. I have no collaborators, no witnesses, no formal record. I have a private journal, a sealed bag of cedar bark material from 1981, a piece of blue sea glass, an eagle feather bound in cedar bark, photographs of footprints that I removed from an archive, and one October night in 2019, when a young one stepped out of the trees while the adult watched from behind it and the river ran gray in the last light, and I understood that the 40 years had been worth every lie I had told and every truth I had kept, and that the trust between us was the most real and most important thing I had ever been part of. The Hoh is still there. The elk are still there. The cedar tree is still there. And in the darkness above mile 11.8, in the old timber on the slope below the ridge, something is living that has been living there longer than this country has had a name, and it is alive today in part because one person, for one career's length of time, chose the silence that protects over the documentation that endangers. I do not know what the young one looks like in daylight. I do not know how old it was on that October night, or what it has become in the 5 years since. I do not know whether the adult I watched for 38 years is still present in the grove, or whether the territory has passed to a younger generation, as all wild things eventually pass what they hold to what comes after them. What I know is that when the young one stood at the edge of the trees and looked in my direction in the dark, I was not afraid. I have not been afraid in that forest for a long time. And When the adult stood behind the young one and watched me, I understood something that I had been understanding in installments for 40 years, and that arrived in that moment, complete. It had brought the young one to see me for reasons that had nothing to do with being remarkable or special or deserving. It had brought the young one to see me because I was safe, and because the young one needed to know what safe looked like. That is why it had chosen me. From the first offering in 1982 to the last offering in 2019, it was not that I was the most capable or the most dedicated or the most knowledgeable person who had ever walked that trail, but because I was consistent, because I came back, because when I said, through every offering and every protected silence, that I would not betray what I had found, I meant it, and I kept meaning it, year after year, long enough for meaning it to become indistinguishable from who I was. Trust is not given to the impressive, it is given to the reliable, and reliability, over 40 years, in an old-growth cedar grove on the Hoh River Trail in Olympic National Park, in the dark, with the river running and the forest settling into its October quiet, looks like this. You sit on your log and you do not move and you wait. And eventually, what is watching you from the trees decides that the waiting has gone on long enough to mean something, and it steps into the open, and you see it, and you let it see you, and then it goes back into the dark, and you walk home. That is all there is to say. That is the whole story. The young one is growing up in the oldest forest in the lower 48 states, learning the valley as its kind has always learned it, from the inside out, with the river and the elk and the rain and the 1,000-year cedar and the slow accumulation of everything the high country has to teach. And somewhere in that learning, in whatever way such things are communicated between a parent and a young one, in a species that has no written language and needs none, is the fact of me, the ranger who walked the trail for 38 years and left salmon at the base of the big tree and kept his mouth shut. The person who was there. I am glad I was there. Let me go back to the middle, because there are things in the middle that I have not told you yet, and the middle deserves more than a summary. 1994 was significant in ways that took me several years to fully process. By that point, I had been in the Hoh corridor for 15 years. I had been maintaining the offering relationship at the cedar tree for 12, and I had established what I thought was a stable pattern of contact and response that I had learned to read with reasonable confidence. What changed in the spring of '94 was the contact moved off the offering site entirely and happened in a new location. And the new location was one that I had not chosen and had not set up for, which meant the contact had been initiated on terms that were not mine. I was on a mid-June patrol, inbound from the Glacier Meadows end of the trail, moving south toward the ranger station after a 3-day upper mountain inspection. It was late morning, the weather clear in the way it is only occasionally clear in the Hoh, with actual direct sunlight hitting the valley floor through a break in the cloud system coming off the Pacific, and the forest was doing something it very rarely does, which is being lit from above in a way that makes the green of the moss almost painful to look at. I was 4 hours south of Glacier Meadows and moving at a good pace when I came around a bend in the trail at a point I would estimate at mile 13.2, and found the trail in front of me, blocked, not by a blowdown, not by any natural event, by a pile of objects placed in the center of the trail with a deliberateness that was unmistakable. I stopped and looked at it for a long time before I approached. The pile was about 2 feet high and roughly circular in its base, maybe 3 feet across. It consisted of the following: several dozen smooth river stones of various sizes, all from the Hoh River drainage, arranged in a rough base layer. Stacked on the stones, a collection of elk shed antler pieces, not a full rack but sections of shed antler of various ages, some with weathering that suggested they had been collected over more than one season. On top of the antler pieces, 2 steelhead trout, whole and unprocessed, that had been caught so recently they were still firm, and on top of the fish, a single western red cedar bough, fresh cut, the needles still fully turgid and green. I am telling you this from 29 years away. I have read my journal entry from that day so many times that I have essentially memorized it. The entry is 3 pages long and details every element of the arrangement with the precision I had learned to apply to physical evidence. But the precision is not the point of the entry. The point of the entry, which I returned to in the margin 6 months later when I was reading it again, is a single sentence I wrote at the end. I do not know what this was meant to say, but I know that it was said. I stood in the trail for a long time and looked at the arrangement, and then I took it apart carefully, putting the stones back to the side of the trail, returning the antler pieces to the forest margin, carrying the cedar bough with me, and taking the 2 steelhead. I ate one of the steelhead for dinner at the ranger station that night. It was the best fish I had eaten in years. The cedar bough I kept until it dried and the needles began to drop, and then I put it in the box with everything else. Someone had left me a gift in the middle of the trail, not at the offering site. In daylight, in full sight of anyone who might come around that bend. This was not the behavior of something trying to remain concealed. This was the behavior of something that had decided to extend the terms of our exchange, on its own initiative, into a location and a time that it controlled. I had been feeding it at a specific site for 12 years. It was now leaving things for me in the middle of my patrol trail. I have sat with the meaning of that for 30 years, and what I believe as carefully and as honestly as I can state a belief about a subject this far outside any framework I was trained in is that it was a communication about the relationship, about the fact that the relationship had changed, that it was no longer simply me making offerings at a fixed location and receiving whatever response came back to that location, that it had moved past the stage of a receiving relationship into an exchange more balanced, more reciprocal, more accurately described as mutual. The offering on the trail was not a gift in the sense of a transaction. It was a statement about who we were to each other at that point in the long accumulation of contact and care and trust. I am a practical man from Sequim, Washington. My father voted in every election and never missed a day of work. I do not say things like that easily or without examination, but 30 years of examination has not changed my reading of the steelhead and the river stones and the cedar bough in the middle of the Hoh River Trail on a clear June morning in 1994. It was a statement, and I received it. The years between 94 and 2004 were, in some ways, the most stable period of the relationship. The exchange was established. The location was the cedar grove, with occasional variations like the trail offering that were clearly intentional rather than accidental. The food I provided was reliable and the responses I received were reliable, and the quality of the reliability was a particular kind of quality that I can only describe by analogy. It was the quality of a long friendship between two people who have long since stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. The understanding is there. The care is there. The attention is there. The words are not necessary because the words were said, in their own way, a long time ago. And what remains is the thing the words were pointing at. 2004 brought a disruption in the pattern that I will be honest about. It frightened me. For the first time in the 22 years of the relationship, I went to the cedar tree on a June patrol and found that the offering I had left 2 days earlier had not been disturbed. I checked the site with the care I brought to every inspection, looking for any sign that I had missed something, that the offering had been moved rather than taken, or that I was misremembering the location where I had placed it. Everything was as I had left it. The salmon was there. The service berries were there. Nothing had touched them. I left a fresh offering and returned in 2 days. Again, untouched. I left a third offering and returned the next day, untouched. For 3 weeks in June of 2004, no offering I left at the cedar tree was taken. For 3 weeks, the site was as still as it would have been if the previous 22 years had not happened. I do not have words for what those 3 weeks were like. The closest I can come is to say that the silence felt like loss in a way that I was not prepared for. because I had not understood until the silence arrived how completely the relationship had become part of my interior life. I had known intellectually that I had spent 22 years building a real thing. I had not understood that what I had built in myself was the part of me that knew how to be in that forest, and that the forest without the relationship was a different forest than the forest with it, and the different forest was one I did not know how to be in. In the 4th week I left an offering and came back the following morning, and it was gone. I sat at the cedar tree for a while before I walked back to the ranger station. I had no way to know what those 3 weeks had meant, whether there had been illness or a season of absence for reasons I could not trace, or whether the absence was itself a communication about what I had done or not done in the weeks preceding it. I thought back over my recent patrols with the same attention I brought to every other kind of field analysis, and could identify nothing that seemed like an obvious cause. I had not brought anyone to the grove. I had not altered my offering routine. I had not made any decisions about the corridor that would have changed the pattern of human activity in the upper drainage. As far as I could reconstruct, I had done everything the same as I always had. I decided to proceed as I had always proceeded. Leave the offerings. Return. Pay attention. Not assume. The 3 weeks were the 3 weeks. The relationship was the relationship. I had 22 years of pattern to stand on, and I was going to stand on it. I never found out what caused the 3-week interruption. I accepted that I was never going to find out, and I accepted that accepting it was part of what the relationship required of me. There are things that happen in the interior lives of other beings that you do not have access to and are not entitled to. The relationship is not yours. You are in it, but it is not yours. You show up, you do your part, you respect what you cannot know, and you continue. I continued for another 13 years. That is the middle. That is what the middle looks like when it is lived rather than summarized. By the time I retired in 2017, I had accumulated 40 years of relationship with a stretch of trail in the oldest intact temperate rainforest in the lower 48 states. And the relationship had given me more than I had given it, which is true of all relationships that are working the way they are supposed to work. It had given me a way of being attentive that I could not have developed in any other context. It had given me a practice of patience that I apply to every hour of the ordinary days I now live in Forks. It had given me a framework for understanding trust, what it is made of, what it costs, what it produces that I would not trade for any credential or recognition or institutional validation I might have accumulated by making different choices. And it had given me the October night with the young one, which I will carry as long as I am able to carry anything. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and it is the thing I have told least easily to myself, let alone to anyone else. In the spring of 2015, 2 years before my retirement, and 4 years before the October night, I was on a late May patrol in the upper drainage, moving north through the corridor in light rain, the kind of Hoh rain that is less precipitation than it is atmosphere, not falling so much as present, saturating everything, including you, within the first 10 minutes, and then being irrelevant because you are simply wet and the question of dry is no longer on the table. I was at mile 12, about 3/4 of a mile past the cedar grove, when I heard the kind of vocalization I had last heard described to me by the hikers at Happy 4 in 1993, and that I had misidentified for them as a Roosevelt elk. I heard it clearly and for longer than any previous vocalization event I had directly witnessed in the 22 years before that I had been in the drainage without a seasonal ranger partner. A series of low percussive sounds, rhythmic, with a subsonic resonance underneath them that I felt through the soles of my boots. It lasted approximately 20 minutes. It was not directed at me. It was coming from a direction that suggested it was oriented toward the ridge, toward the high country above, as if it was communicating with something above and behind it on the slope. I stood on the trail in the rain and listened for the full 20 minutes. And when it stopped, I stood for a while longer in case it resumed. It did not resume. I walked onto the ranger station, and I wrote in my private journal that night about what I had heard, and about what I understood it to mean given everything I knew about the seasonal and behavioral patterns I had been observing for over 30 years. What I understood was that I was hearing a long-range communication directed toward what was not in the lower valley, that the communication originated in or near the Cedar Grove territory, and that the distance from the grove to the ridge above was not an obstacle. What I understood was that the Upper Hoh was not a territory with a single occupant. It was a territory with a home range that extended from the valley floor to the ridge line and beyond, and that the valley use I had been witnessing was seasonal, one part of a range that included high country that I had never had access to and never would. I had spent 33 years thinking of the Cedar Grove as the center of the territory. On that May afternoon in the rain, I understood that the Cedar Grove was not the center. It was the margin, the edge of the territory closest to the human world, the place where the ancient high country range touched the managed wilderness that I represented. I had been privileged to interact at that margin for 33 years, and I had mistaken the margin for the whole. The whole was vast. The whole was the ridge and the high country and the river headwaters and the glacier and the terrain above the tree line that nobody managed and nobody patrolled and nobody documented. The whole was everything above and beyond what I could see from the trail. The margin was where the offering was left and where the offerings were taken and where the cedar tree stood with its 11 by 14-inch pattern of incised lines on the south face. The margin was where the exchange happened. The whole I would never know. The margin was more than enough. I retired in 2017, having walked the Hoh River Trail to the Cedar Grove at mile 11.8 more times than I can accurately count. Having left offerings at that tree for 35 seasons, having lied to colleagues I respected in order to keep the location private, having made peace with those lies, as you make peace with a difficult thing you are certain was right. And on an October night in 2019, 2 years retired and walking the trail one final time as a private citizen with a light pack and cedar-wrapped salmon, I sat on a log in the dark and the young one came out of the trees and looked at me. I thought, in that moment, about Phil Denning and his penciled X marks and the thing he had said about knowing when you needed to know. I thought about Henry Payne's onion skin notes and Martin Eastman's description of the watchers of the High Valley who had kept the elk there since before memory. I thought about Sandra Prentice and Danny Cho and Richard Allard and the necessary conversations I had managed with each of them, the careful containment of their attention, the mild redirections and plausible explanations that had kept the Cedar Grove private for 40 years. I thought about Carol Estes looking across a dinner table at a person who was only partially there. I thought about 38 years of patrol logs that were accurate in every particular that could be documented and silent in the one particular that mattered most. And I thought about the young one, at the edge of the trees in the dark, uncertain and watchful, learning from behind the adult what the human sitting on the log meant, whether it was safe to be seen. Learning what its parent had learned over 40 years of offerings and silences, the slow education in what this one human being was and what he was not. I am Tom Harlan. I am 72 years old. I live in Forks, Washington, 4 blocks from the main road. The Hoh is 12 miles away. The cedar tree at mile 11.8 is still there, waiting for the next spring offering from whoever comes to it next, if anyone does. I have not told the rangers who work that corridor what is in the grove or what might be in the high country above it. That is not my information to give. It is the grove's information, and it will be given on the grove's schedule to whoever earns the right to receive it in the way that trust is always earned, by showing up again and again with something honest in your hands. In the months since that October night, I have had time to think about what it means to have spent a life doing what I did, not the ranger work. I know what that meant, and it meant a great deal, and the trails I maintained and the permits I checked and the searches I assisted with and the visitors I educated and the resource damage I prevented all added up to something real and worthwhile that I can think about with genuine satisfaction. That work meant something, and I am proud of it. I am talking about the other work, the private work, the work that does not appear in any official record and that I could describe to you, if I were honest about its outlines in bureaucratic terms, as 40 years of deception within a federal land management agency, conducted in service of what I personally judge to be the higher interest of an undisclosed third party. That is one accurate way to describe what I did. It is not the only accurate way. Another accurate way. 40 years of relationship with a living being that had no legal standing, no institutional recognition, and no protection from any law or regulation because the law and regulation were built on the premise that such beings do not exist. 40 years of being, for one animal or family of animals in one stretch of valley in one national park, the thing that stood between them and a world that would have destroyed them in the name of science or safety or curiosity. 40 years of showing up. I know which description is more true. I have known for a long time. There are people who will ask why I did not try to change things through official channels, why I did not advocate within the institution for a different kind of wildlife management that could have accommodated what I knew, why I did not find a way to protect the grove without the deception. Those are fair questions, and I have answers to them, though the answers are not satisfying in the mode that clean answers satisfy. The answers are practical. The practical answer is that the institutional world does not protect what it does not believe in, and the institutional world would not have believed what I was telling it without evidence, and producing the evidence would have created the documentation that was more dangerous to the cedar grove than any predator or habitat loss or climate stress. You do not protect what matters by making it legible to the institutions that would respond to that legibility with protocols designed for a world where the thing does not exist. You protect it by keeping it invisible to those institutions. Invisible things are safe in ways that documented things are not. I would change nothing except possibly the documentation of my private journal, which is better than nothing but not as systematic as it should be. The journal covers 40 years of observations in a format that only I can navigate completely because only I know the shorthand I developed over those years for the specific behavioral and locational patterns I was tracking. When I am gone, the journal will be either useless or misleading to anyone who finds it without the contextual knowledge that makes it readable. I have been working, since the October night, on a cleaner version, a document that someone with attentiveness and patience and the right disposition could read and understand, not as evidence, not as documentation of a subject that needs to be verified or investigated or added to any scientific record, but as a guide to the margin, the edge of the territory closest to the human world, where someone with offerings and patience and a willingness to keep showing up might eventually be seen in the same way I was seen. I do not know who that person will be. It might be nobody for a long time. The grove does not need a human presence to function. It was there before me, and it will be there after me, and the offerings I left were appreciated but are not necessary to what lives there. But I think the exchange that happened over 40 years was real on both sides of it. And I think a real thing, once it has existed, leaves a shape in the world that can be found again by the right person. The grove knows what a human being who comes honestly looks like, from the inside of the offering, from the smell of the salmon and the behavior of someone who sits on a log in the dark and does not advance. That knowledge does not disappear when I am gone. It is in the bark of the cedar tree and the compaction of the duff under the root buttress and the shape of the high country territory that extends from the margin to the ridge. It is there. I am telling this story because I want it to be in the world, not in a file cabinet or an archive or a box in a closet. In the world, moving the way stories move, finding the people who need to hear it. The ranger who is 2 years into a corridor they have been assigned to, who has noticed an anomaly at the edge of their range that they do not have a name for and are not sure whether to report. The person who has been hiking the same trail for 10 years and knows that one particular stretch of that trail is different from the rest of it, and has not known what to do with that knowledge. The person who has been leaving something at a specific place in the forest and getting something back, and has been too unsure of what they are experiencing to say it out loud. This is for those people. You are doing the right thing. Keep doing it. Do not report it. Do not bring other people. Do not try to document it in any way that creates a record that can be found. Just keep showing up with something honest in your hands and wait. That is what 40 years taught me. The patience is the point. The showing up is the point. The trust that builds over that time is not a reward for the patience. It is the thing the patience is made of. Every offering is a renewal of the patience. Every time you come back is the patience continuing. And when the patience has gone on long enough that it has become who you are, then you are the kind of person who can be trusted with what is in the cedar grove and with what looks at you from the edge of the trees in the dark. I did not earn the October night with the young one by being good or smart or exceptional in any particular way. I earned it by being consistent, by being the same person at the cedar tree in 2016 as I had been in 1982, doing the same thing for the same reason, with the same intention. Consistency over 40 years is not a passive quality. It is an active one. It requires the decision, made repeatedly and at cost, to keep the commitment when keeping it is inconvenient, when it would be easier to let it lapse, when the institutional pressure to behave differently is real, and the personal consequence of the consistency is isolation. I was alone with this for 40 years. I do not recommend that as the only way to carry a burden like this, but if you find yourself carrying it alone, as I have described, know that the aloneness is not a failure. It is sometimes the condition of the work. The young one is in the upper Hoh drainage tonight, or somewhere in the high country range above it. It is doing what young things do, in a forest that has been doing what it does since before the country it is in had a name. The elk are in the valley. The salmon are in the river. The cedar tree is standing. The rain is coming in, off the Pacific. The world that matters is going on. I am in Forks, 4 blocks from the main road, grateful for every single day of the 38 years and the 40-year relationship they contained. That is the story. The whole story. I do not have a better place to end it than right there, which is where it actually ended, in the dark, on a cedar log, with the river running and the forest quiet and the young one's shape disappearing back into the trees, and the adult following after it, and me sitting still until I was sure I could walk, and then walking home.